Sophie had been looking forward to this evening all week. After a grueling week of work, she finally had the house to herself. She lit a few candles, put on her favorite movie, and wrapped herself in a cozy blanket. But as the first scenes played on the screen, she felt a pang of hunger. Pizza, she thought, hot, cheesy, and comforting. It was the perfect choice for a night like this. She picked up her phone and called her usual spot, Sal's Pizzeria. A familiar voice answered, a little rough around the edges, but friendly enough. Sal's, what can I get you? Hi, I'd like to order a large margarita pizza, please, Sophie replied. Sure thing, the man said. Should be there in about 30 minutes. Thanks, she answered, hanging up. She settled back on the couch, focusing on the movie, but a strange feeling settled over her, like a prickling at the back of her neck. The room felt colder. She glanced at the window, expecting to see it open, but it was shut tight. Maybe she was just tired, she thought, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Minutes ticked by. She glanced at the clock. 9:45 p.m. She should have heard something by now, maybe a car pulling up or footsteps on the porch. But there was nothing, just the faint sound of the wind outside and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Just as she considered calling the pizzeria again, the doorbell rang. Sophie jumped, startled by the sudden noise. She walked to the front door. Pausing for a moment, she couldn't see anyone through the frosted glass pane. She opened the door cautiously. A young delivery boy stood there, holding a pizza box. He was wearing the usual red uniform with the Sal's Pizzeria logo on his chest, but something about his appearance seemed off. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were dark as if he hadn't slept in days. He gave her a blank stare, not saying a word. Hi, Sophie said slowly. That'll be for me. The boy just nodded, his expression unchanged, and handed her the pizza box. Sophie felt a chill run through her as his fingers brushed against hers. His skin was cold, unnaturally so. Thanks, she muttered, reaching for her wallet, but he shook his head quickly, almost too quickly. No need, he whispered, his voice low and flat. It's already been paid for. Sophie blinked. Are you sure? He nodded again, turning abruptly and walking down the steps. She watched him go, confused. She didn't see a car anywhere. He disappeared into the darkness, his figure swallowed up by the night. Sophie stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy. She finally closed the door and returned to the living room. She placed the pizza box on the coffee table and sat down, trying to shake off the weird encounter. But when she opened the box, her heart skipped a beat. The pizza was covered in a dark, thick sauce, almost black, and it smelled strange, like burnt wood and something else she couldn't quite identify. She stared at it, her stomach twisting with an unexpected nausea. She closed the box quickly, the smell too overwhelming. That's when she noticed it, a whispering sound so faint she almost missed it. Her eyes darted around the room, but she saw nothing. The whispering grew louder, as if voices were speaking from all directions. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady, but there was no response, just the endless murmuring, growing louder, more frantic. The lights flickered and she felt a cold draft sweep through the room, extinguishing the candles. Panic began to rise in her chest. She picked up her phone, intending to call someone, anyone, but the screen was black, unresponsive. The whispering turned into a low, rhythmic chant, words she couldn't understand. She backed away, her eyes wide, her breath quick and shallow. Her gaze landed on the pizza box. It was moving slightly, as if something inside it was trying to get out. Suddenly, the box flew open and the room filled with an acrid smoke. Sophie screamed and stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. The light flickered, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. She heard a shuffling sound, like footsteps coming from all around her, closing in. She could feel a presence, something cold and heavy moving closer. "Get out!" she shouted, waving her arms wildly in the dark, but her hands passed through nothing. The air grew colder, and she felt an invisible force brush past her, sending a chill down her spine. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all she could hear. Then they stopped. The silence was deafening. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could barely breathe. She turned, trying to find the light switch, and that's when she saw it. A figure standing in the corner, just outside the reach of the faint moonlight coming through the window. It was the delivery boy, but his features were distorted, his smile too wide, his eyes hollow and dark. "It's not paid for," he whispered, his voice echoing around the room. Sophie felt her knees go weak as the figure moved closer, his feet not touching the ground. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut on its own. She was trapped. The last thing she heard was his laughter, cold and mocking, as the darkness swallowed her whole. When the neighbors found Sophie's house the next morning, the front door was wide open. The living room was in disarray, with the smell of burnt wood lingering in the air, but Sophie was gone. All that remained was the empty pizza box sitting on the coffee table, with a single word scrawled in blackened, greasy letters on the inside of the lid. Unpaid. Ethan lived for quiet Friday nights, the kind where he could unwind after a long week at school. His parents were out of town for the weekend, and he was left to his own devices, which for a 16-year-old meant video games, soda, and the inevitable pizza delivery. He picked up his phone and dialed the number for Tony's Pizzeria, a local joint known for its greasy, satisfying pies. "Hi, can I get a large pepperoni pizza, extra cheese?" he ordered. "Sure thing," the voice on the other end replied, slightly raspy and deep. "It'll be about 30 minutes. Ethan hung up, feeling a bit unnerved by the strange tone, but shrugged it off. It was just a pizza after all. He returned to his game, getting lost in the digital battles on his screen. But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The room felt colder, and he swore he heard faint whispers, but whenever he paused his game, the room was silent. 30 minutes passed, then 40, and still no pizza. Ethan felt his stomach growl in frustration. Just as he was about to call the pizzeria back, the doorbell rang. He jumped up, his heart racing a bit faster than usual. He hadn't heard any car pull up, nor had he seen the headlights flash through his window. He approached the door slowly and peered through the peephole. There was a man standing there, wearing a red cap and the familiar uniform of Tony's Pizzeria. But something seemed off. The man's features were indistinct, like they were blurred, as if Ethan were looking at him through fogged glass. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then shook his head, chiding himself for being ridiculous. He opened the door. The man stood there, holding a pizza box. His face was pale, eyes dark and sunken, and his smile stretched a little too wide. "Your pizza," the man said, his voice low and strangely echoing. Thanks," Ethan muttered, reaching for his wallet. The man simply waved him off. "No charge tonight," the man replied, still smiling that unnerving grin. Ethan blinked, confused. "Why?" The man didn't answer. He just placed the pizza box in Ethan's hands, tipped his cap, and turned away, walking slowly down the path without another word. Ethan watched him disappear into the shadows. No car was in sight. He shut the door quickly, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He placed the pizza on the kitchen counter and stared at it, a strange feeling gnawing at his insides. The box felt heavier than it should have, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible humming noise coming from within. Curiosity getting the better of him, Ethan slowly lifted the lid. His breath caught in his throat. The pizza was there, but it was wrong. The toppings seemed to be writhing, moving slowly like maggots crawling over spoiled meat. The cheese bubbled as if it were alive, and the pepperoni slices seemed to twist and form shapes that made no sense. He slammed the lid shut, his hands trembling. "What the hell?" he whispered to himself. He could hear the humming sound growing louder, now accompanied by faint whispers, barely audible but unmistakably there. The lights in the kitchen flickered. The air grew colder, and Ethan felt a presence, a heavy, suffocating sensation like someone was standing right behind him. He spun around, but the kitchen was empty, yet he could feel eyes on him, feel something watching. The whispers grew louder, now distinct voices calling his name. "Ethan! Ethan!" His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he backed away from the counter. The pizza box slid off the edge and hit the floor with a dull thud, but the humming persisted. Ethan turned and ran toward the living room, his mind racing with panic. As he reached the doorway, the TV turned on by itself, the screen filled with static. A distorted face, vaguely familiar, appeared amidst the static, eyes black as coal, mouth open in a silent scream. Ethan tried to turn it off, but the remote wouldn't respond. The face on the screen began to speak in the same raspy voice from the phone earlier. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Ethan." He stumbled backward, and the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers surrounded him, louder and closer. He could feel cold breath on his neck, hear faint, mocking laughter. He turned around, desperately trying to see in the dark, and there he was, the delivery man, standing in the middle of the living room, smiling that wide, unnatural smile. Ethan screamed and bolted for the front door, but it slammed shut in his face. He was trapped. The man stepped closer, his form flickering like a distorted image, eyes now completely black, face melting into shadows. "No charge tonight," the man whispered, his voice now a hiss, "but there's always a cost." And then everything went black. When Ethan's parents returned the next morning, they found the house eerily silent. The pizza was still on the kitchen floor, the box empty, and Ethan was nowhere to be found. Only the faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, and a single word scrawled in black ash on the living room wall: "Paid."